Now, in today's podcast, I'm going to talk about a teaching pioneer. A teaching pioneer. I guess I should tell you first, what is a pioneer? What does that word mean? If you don't know, a pioneer is a person who does something first. Right? There's someone who does something first. Of course, we can have pioneers with an S, plural. That means a group of people who do something first. So, for example, in the United States, maybe, 150 years ago or more, there were a group of people that we call the pioneers. The pioneers. Who were they? Well, in American history, the pioneers were people who moved to the western part of the United States. So at that time, a long time ago, most people in the United States lived on the East Coast. And the West was mostly empty of Europeans. There were Native Americans there, but there were not Europeans there. And so people from the East began to move to the West. They were the first people to move westward from the eastern United States. They were called the pioneers because they were the first group of people to do that. So when I talk about a teaching pioneer, Dr. James Asher, I'm talking about someone in the field of teaching and education who was the first to do something. Right? He was an innovator. He did something new. He created something new in teaching and education. And he is one of the teaching pioneers that I admire and that I learned from. Not directly, I was not his direct student, but I read about his research, I read about his techniques, and I've read several of his books. So he influenced me a lot. And Dr. James Asher is a very interesting man. So he's a professor of language at, I believe it's San Jose State University. San Jose is about 1 hour south of San Francisco. So it's in Northern California. So he's a professor at a university. And maybe 30 years ago, maybe even more than that, but 30 years ago or so, he began to do research on teaching language. And he felt that the normal way of teaching language was not very effective. Just as I do. He felt the same way that I do, and that you probably do as well. So grammar, translation, textbooks, he didn't like any of that. He felt it was very slow and inefficient and not fun and painful and just didn't work very well for most people. So he wanted to create a different way of teaching and learning languages. And he eventually began to experiment with using physical actions to teach language. See, Dr. Asher, he did not want to use translation for teaching a language. He felt that translating, meaning you go from one language to another and then back to the other one again, he felt that was a very slow and unnatural way to try to speak a language, right? For example, if you are Japanese and you want to speak English, it's very slow to hear something in English, then translate the meaning into Japanese, then think of your answer in Japanese, then translate your answer from Japanese back to English, and then say it. Right? That's a slow process. You can do that when you're writing and reading. If you have a lot of time, it's okay. But when you're speaking, there's no time. And people who translate in their mind when they speak, their speaking is unnatural and they stop a lot because they're always thinking and they're always translating. See what I mean? And for the native speakers, when they hear this, it sounds quite unnatural, and it's difficult for them to listen to someone speak like that for a long time. Because it takes a lot of patience. You're waiting because the person is speaking so strangely and slowly. So, Dr. Asher realized, well, that's not a good way to learn to speak a language. And he was thinking and thinking, how can I teach language without translating? For example, if someone wants to learn English, maybe a child or an adult, how do I teach them words if I don't know their language? How can I do that? Well, there are different ways you can do that, but he decided to use actions. He decided to start teaching the language with actions. So his very first lesson, for example, might be sit and stand, right? He would sit in a chair, and he would say, sit. Everyone would look at him. Okay, he said this word, and he's sitting. Then he would say, stand up to the class. And as he stood up, he would say it again, stand up, and then he would stand at the same time. And then he would say, sit down, and he would sit down. And after demonstrating this a couple of times, the class would begin to understand. At least a few people would understand. Stand means stand, sit means sit. So the next step of Dr. Asher's method would be to start doing this with the class. So he would say, stand up. He would stand up, and he would point to the class and encourage them to stand at the same time. And they would all start standing up with him. He would say, sit down, and he and the entire class would sit down together. And then finally, the last step would be kind of a game. He would say, stand up or sit down, but he would not do it. He would do nothing. He would just wait for the class to do it. This is the most basic way to teach the method he created, which is called total physical response. The physical part is very important because it's based on using physical actions, using your body connected to the meaning of words and phrases. Now, obviously, stand up and sit down are very simple examples. But eventually, students who learn with Dr. Asher would learn to understand long, complex sentences. For example, he might say, stand up, turn around 4 times, then walk backwards, touch the blue book, pick it up, bring it to Susie, then sit down again. Right? That's a long sentence, a long command in English. Even for me as a native speaker, it would be difficult to remember all parts of it. I would have to really focus. And yet, his students began to understand these very complex sentences. And then they would perform the actions. He created ways to teach colors and numbers and other adjectives using actions. For example, he might have a large book and a small book. He would say, pick up the large book. So maybe the students already know the word book, and they already know the phrase pick up. So then he says, pick up the large book. If they pick up the small book, he says, no. Pick up the large book. Then they pick up the other one, the large one, and he says, yes. Very quickly they understand large and small, big and little, things like that. And so by being very creative in this way, Dr. Asher developed a very complete system where he could even teach verb tenses. He would use a play clock so they could practice things happening in the past or in the future. And the main point was that there were always actions. Another main point is that they always started with listening. See, in the beginning, the students did nothing but listen and then do physical actions. They would perform the actions. So it was lots and lots of input, lots and lots of listening, and constantly moving and connecting the language with physical action. Those are the key points of his system, which he called total physical response. Now next, after doing this, he found that his students were doing very well. They seemed to be learning much faster and remembering better and performing better. So he decided that he needed research. He needed to compare students in his class with students using normal methods. So there were a lot of studies to test his method against normal grammar translation textbook methods. He used different languages too, sometimes English, sometimes German, sometimes Japanese. So he learned, he used Asian and European languages and English. And so he wanted to be sure it worked for all different languages. And so what he basically found was this, that this method, this physical method, was much better at teaching vocabulary. So in other words, students who learned with his method, they learned 2 or 3 or 4 times as much vocabulary compared to the students in the normal class. They learned 3, 4 times more. Even more importantly, they remembered it longer, for long-term memory. So in some of the studies, they stopped all the classes and they waited 1 year. 1 year with no extra classes, no learning at all. And then they tested them again after 1 year. And the TPR students, the ones that learned with physical actions, they remembered 2, 3, or 4 times as much or more of the vocabulary, even 1 year later. The students who learned the vocabulary in the normal textbook way forgot most of it. Not all of it, but most of it. Something else interesting. He found that the people who learned with his method had much better listening skills. They performed better on listening tests than the group who used textbooks and learned in a normal classroom. And I guess that's not surprising, right? Because his method used so much listening. Now, here's something that is surprising. They were equal in speaking ability, and his students actually performed the same or better on grammar tests. So the same or better with speaking, the same or better with grammar, even though they never specifically taught them speaking or grammar. Interesting. So the same or better, speaking the same or better in grammar, like a normal grammar test, better listening, better vocabulary, and I believe it was better pronunciation. I'm not sure about pronunciation. Same or better pronunciation. So quite interesting. So what I find with this study, the important key here is especially with vocabulary. I mean, everything else is the same or better, but vocabulary and listening especially are really powerful. And this is why I, in my system, highly recommend using physical actions when you are learning new words or phrases. When I do a story lesson, a mini story lesson with a live group, with a real audience, a real class, I will usually teach new phrases, new words, with actions first. So I connect the new phrase, the new word, or the new words with some kind of physical action. And then we practice it again and again, and I test it. I use Dr. Asher's same method. And it's a lot of fun for a short time. The class yells and jumps, and the class is yelling and doing the actions very powerfully and strongly. And very, very quickly, they learn the new words. And they don't forget them. Right? I always get emails from people who came to a class, and they always remember those new phrases. Months and months and months and months later, even though they never studied them again. This is super powerful. Now, it's not the only method, because you do need to do other things also. So that's why the effortless English system is not just Dr. Asher's system, because it has limitations also. Dr. Asher's system has some limitations. For example, with this, it's hard to teach very abstract words. Like a word like government is a common example. How do you teach government with an action? It's kind of difficult to think of a word that connects to that meaning that would help you remember it. But that's okay. So sometimes some words you can't really use this for, but there are a lot of words that you can. If you're creative, you can think of some movement, some action that will connect to the meaning and will help you remember that phrase or that word. It's very powerful, and you will remember it so much faster. The study time is shorter, and you'll remember it longer. You won't forget it as easily. This is very, very powerful technique, and Dr. James Asher developed it. So that's why I feel he is a pioneer, right? He's one of the great pioneers of language teaching who found a better way of teaching language. Much better than just translating and trying to remember lists of words. This is a great way for teachers, language teachers. This is a great way to teach total beginners who know nothing. You can do 10 or 15 or 20 minutes of this method to teach a lot of different words and verbs and actions. Very quickly, the students will learn the brand new vocabulary, the totally new vocabulary. And then after they learn some vocabulary, then you can start using stories and other methods that we use in Effortless English. So this is part of our system, and it's a very powerful part. You see, when you connect your body, when you connect actions to words and to meaning, it makes more connections in your brain. That's why you remember it much longer, and why it's easier to remember new things when you're using physical actions. Also, too, when you're using physical actions to learn a language or to learn anything, you have more energy, right? You're moving, especially if you do the actions with a lot of power and a lot of emotion, which is what I always recommend in our system. So I always tell our students, don't just do an action with just a little energy, do it with powerful energy, very strongly, quickly, with a lot of force and energy. Right? Don't just stand up slowly. If you're learning stand up with power, quickly, stand up, then sit down. A lot of energy, a lot of power, right? That wakes you up. It wakes up your brain. It makes the connections even stronger. It improves your concentration, improves your focus. You learn faster, you remember longer, everything is better. So, in your own learning of English, try to use actions whenever possible. If you're learning a new phrase or a new word, if possible, think of an action, a movement with your hands, with your body, with your face that will remind you of the meaning, that connects to the meaning in your mind. It can be anything. And then practice saying the word or saying the phrase and doing the action very powerfully. You say the word and you do the action. Say the word, do the action. Say the word, do the action. Strongly, powerfully, again and again and again and again and again. And in a short time, you will remember that word, and you'll remember it much longer. This is a much better way to study vocabulary. And another final point about this is that anytime you're listening to English or studying English, you should be moving your body. Even if you're not using actions to remember certain words or phrases, you should at least be walking or standing up. Even just walking around your room a little bit, listening to your computer or iPod, or going outside and walking. Just keeping your body moving, because that keeps your blood moving. It keeps your brain more awake, so you have better concentration, better focus, better memory. So use actions in your English learning. Use physical movement. And say thank you to Dr. James Asher for creating this very powerful method. All right, I will see you next time. As always, go to effortlessenglishclub.com to learn more about our lessons. Again, to learn more about Effortless English lessons and our Power English Pack, go to effortlessenglishclub.com. I will see you there. Bye-bye.